Hey everybody, welcome back to the On Centerline podcast. Welcome to all of you out there in podcast land, and welcome to all of you watching on YouTube. Glad to have you with us today. Should we go around on a check ride? That's the question we're going to answer today, along with some other thoughts on stabilized approaches and landings for your check ride. So, should you go around on your check ride? And the short answer is yes. You should never be afraid to go around on your check ride, with only one little exception for you commercial pilot candidates, and that's the Power Off 180. But we'll get to that here in a little bit. When it comes to your normal soft and short field approaches and landings, not only can you go around without consequence to a certain extent, of course, if you are continually going around 3-4 times for one landing simply because you can't quite line it up or you're not feeling good about it, at that point, not only should you perhaps consider discontinuing, but the examiner is probably not going to let you keep going in that regard. But within the realm of reasonability, not only can you go around, but if we look in the ACS here, under the skills, I'm just going to go down the list of skills. We'll stop when something kind of stands out to us. The skills you're expected to demonstrate are: complete the appropriate checklist, make radio calls as appropriate, ensure the airplane is aligned with the correct assigned runway, scan the runway or landing surface, select and aim for suitable touchdown point, establish the recommended approach and landing configuration. We're going to come back to that. Maintain manufacturer's published approach airspeed, maintain directional control and appropriate crosswind correction, make smooth, timely, and correct control application, touch down at a proper pitch attitude within 200 feet beyond or on a specified point, and, almost last but not least, execute a timely go-around if the approach cannot be made within the tolerances specified above or for any other condition that may result in an unsafe approach or landing. And then finally, the last one is use runway incursion avoidance procedures if applicable. So, can you go around on a check ride? Not only can you, but straight from the ACS, you are expected to do a go-around if you cannot hit the spot that you've specified, or for any other reason having to do with safety of flight. So if you say, hey, I'm going to land on 1,000 footers or the second stripe or whatever it is, if you think you're not going to make it, you're going to come in short, or if you're floating too far, you are expected to go around. So never ever feel like you cannot go around on a check ride, whether you're a private pilot, commercial pilot. Fortunately, you instrument pilots out there don't have any takeoff and landings per se on your check ride, so you don't have to really worry about it. But you should always be expecting and prepared to go around. And that's how I teach my students, is that every approach we make to a runway, we are actually expecting to go around. And the landing, should it actually happen, is a pleasant surprise. But it's the go around that's the intention. And it's the landing that is the pleasant surprise if it happens. All right. So many students that I see or work with, they just, or for whatever reason, get it in their heads that they cannot go around for a check ride, and they will just land long or land short or whatever happens, and they'll take the L on that check ride. And that's an expensive L to take. So we want to make sure you're not ending a check ride that way. So always remember, not only can you go around, it is expected of you to do so if you're not able to make that landing properly. All right, so that kind of covers that question that we wanted to start with, which is, can you go around on a check ride? And now I wanted to expand into kind of what I hinted at earlier, which is that it's so often the case where the landing itself is what gets all the attention on the check ride or in check ride preparation. And the approach to that landing is kind of just either overlooked or a means to an end. So I wanted to talk about the different types of approaches for a certain type of landing, because the type of approach you do should match up with the type of landing you're demonstrating. What do I mean by that? Well, let's see here. Every single approach and landing task in the ACS under the knowledge section is going to talk about a stabilized approach. Well, what constitutes a stabilized approach? Well, first of all, for me, it's important to talk about when do we consider an approach to have begun. Now, if you're doing an instrument approach, then we often talk about the final approach fix or things like that as to where and when we want to be stabilized, and we'll have certain criteria involved with what classifies as being stabilized in that realm. But when we're in the pattern, at what point does your approach start? And at what point should you be stabilized on that approach? And for me, when we're in the pattern, I always talk about the key to a successful landing is a successful pattern. And that pattern starts on departure. When we take off from the runway in left closed traffic or right closed traffic, that's when our pattern starts. So the argument could be made that that's when our approach starts. So I like to see a stabilized pattern from the moment of departure all the way around the traffic pattern. But certainly for our purposes today, let's just talk about from downwind on. From downwind on, I like to be on speed, configured for that portion of the pattern, and then staying configured, changing our configuration as appropriate as we fly the pattern around from downwind to base, base to final. Okay. So I'm looking in the pattern in a 172 for 80 knots on downwind. Okay. 80 knots on downwind, 70 knots on base, 60 knots on final. A lot of people fly closer to 65 knots on final. And while you can do that, first of all, at our airport at Twin Oaks, we have a relatively short runway. So we pretty much treat every landing almost like a short field landing. And the difference in the amount of float that you get from 60 to 65 in a 172 can be significant. So typically we'll reserve a speed of 65 for either longer runways or if there's any type of turbulence or wind shear. But realistically, if we're looking to hit a certain spot, no matter how long the runway itself is, flying closer to 60 is going to give you a lot more control over when that plane actually touches down. So 80, 70, 60, and the standard kind of flap configuration might be 10 degrees on the downwind as we start the descent, 20 degrees on base, 30 degrees on final. Now, there's going to be different variations to this depending on perhaps the terrain and your location, depending on your specific aircraft, and also depending on the type of approach and landing you're doing. So for our normal approach and landing, we want to see those speeds, 80 on downwind, 70 on base, 60 on final, under control throughout the pattern. So that by the time I am turning final, I am at no point going to be faster than 70. I was 70 on base. By the time I'm turning final, I should be slowing towards 60, okay? Getting the last bit of flaps in for that approach and on a proper glide path to the runway. Our approach for a normal approach and landing should generally be our standard 3-degree glide slope. Now, depending on your location, like at Twin Oaks, we don't have, first of all, any type of visual approach slope indicator. We don't have a PAPI or a VASI or anything like that. So you just kind of have to eyeball it. But we also have trees and other obstacles along our approach path that generally kind of lend themselves to, it lends itself to having a little bit of a steeper approach. So if your airport is similar, You might not have exactly that 3-degree glide slope. You might have slightly steeper approach depending on your location, and you will do that as appropriate. But it should be as close to a normal glide path, glide angle as possible. Okay, as close to that 3-degree glide slope as possible. It should be a normal approach speed as specified by your POH for your aircraft. And as far as the actual round out and touchdown, you'll round out over the runway, perhaps have a little extra airspeed to bleed off while you then touch down on your spot and let the airplane roll out normally without any excessive braking. So what would not constitute a stabilized approach for a normal approach and landing? Well, one big thing that I see people doing is they'll be high on final, maybe fast, and they'll start doing a forward slip. In my mind, if you're having to do a forward slip for a normal approach and landing, that is not a stabilized approach. A forward slip is not a normal maneuver on final. It's a tool we have, but as far as a normal stabilized approach and landing, you should not require a forward slip. We shouldn't have to make any huge pitch changes to adjust for altitude or speed. And the amount of flaps that we're using, again, should be within the normal range as specified in your POH. So that's just one example of what might constitute an unstabilized approach for a normal approach and landing. All right, so that's our normal approach and landing. Let's talk about our soft field approach and landing. Now, as far as an approach to a soft field, there's not really going to be a whole lot necessarily different than there is for a normal approach. A soft field approach, all else being equal, should really just be the same as a normal approach. The only difference is that perhaps, if in a real world situation, many soft fields happen to be within areas of higher terrain, perhaps have trees around them, and those are considerations you're going to have to deal with and make choices on. But all else being equal, a soft field approach to landing is very much similar to a normal approach and landing. So let's talk about some of the differences. In a soft field landing, we want to minimize our rate of descent and keep the weight on the wings as long as possible. In order to do that, we may opt to use a little extra power or keep the power we have on our final approach in a little bit longer. We might use that power to allow us to set that plane down nice and softly so that we don't just kind of plump down or hit too hard, because we want to make sure the weight stays on those wings as long as possible, allow those wheels to touch softly and dissipate that speed and energy slowly. The other thing that's going to be different in that regard is that we're going to really exaggerate our round out to the point where we're going to bleed off as much energy as we can, getting that nose up in the air, allowing the mains to touch down softly, and then continuing to bleed that speed and energy off while the nose stays in the air until we let it down nice and softly. We always want to protect that nose wheel. We don't want it getting caught in any gopher holes or anything like that and cause damage to the aircraft. So what does a stabilized approach look like for a soft field? Again, this is going to be very much dependent on the actual location you're at, the actual soft field, what's around it, what type of terrain or trees are along the approach. Would a forward slip be appropriate for a soft field approach and landing? Well, possibly. The soft field, as I said, all else being equal, is not that different from a normal approach and landing. However, it could also borrow some elements from the short field approach and landing, because we often find soft fields that are short. So we often find ourselves kind of combining the techniques of short and soft field approaches and landing. So a forward slip could be appropriate, but again, that's going to be very much dependent on the location. And if you're not at a location, in this case, we're talking about your check ride. So if your check ride's realistically not at a location that would require a steeper approach or a forward slip, if it's just kind of a bad approach that you didn't set up correctly, then I would say no, it should not need that forward slip. It should not need a higher rate of descent, and therefore it's probably not stabilized if you find yourself in that position. Best to go around and try it again. All right, so looking forward now to that short field approach and landing. Short field approaches and landing are probably the most different out of any of these, okay? Again, the soft field kind of connects the gap between the normal and short at times, bridges the gap rather. But when we're looking at the short field approach and landing, short field, we are generally going to simulate clearing an obstacle, a 50-foot obstacle on the approach. So because of that, your short field approach should be slightly steeper than your normal approach and landing. Now, this shouldn't be excessive, okay? It doesn't take a lot to clear a 50-foot obstacle, but just coming in slightly higher than normal would be an appropriate thing to demonstrate for a short field approach and landing. To that end, if your aircraft is equipped with, say, 40 degrees of flaps, as many older 172s are, this would be the time to use those 40 degrees of flaps. We never really use 40 degrees of flaps for a normal or soft field, because once you go from 30 to 40 degrees of flaps, it creates nothing but drag. And all that drag takes that airplane one direction, and that is straight down. So that's why it actually lends itself really well to the short field approach and landing, because as you come over that obstacle, that 50-foot obstacle, you're going to be a little bit higher. Put the last notch of those flaps in there down to 40, allows you to get that nose down to clear that obstacle and come down for that short field landing. So you'll be using all the flaps you have available to you in this short field approach and landing, although usually we reserve that last bit for the very shortest of final. So you don't want to be riding all the way down on final with full flaps. That's just inefficient and not necessary. Now, the other part to the short field landing, approach and landing, is ultimately we're going to come in a little slower than normal. I have videos on this you can check out here. I'll put the card up here in the corner for those of you watching on YouTube. And by the time we actually set down on the runway and round out and actually touch down for our short field landing, there should be little to no energy left in that plane. If you are coming in on a short field approach and landing and you're rounding out 200, 400 or more 100 feet prior to your touchdown point, you are not doing a short field approach and landing. You are doing, at best, a normal or even possibly a soft field approach and landing, because you have just way too much energy in that plane. Remember, a short field, the idea is we want to get on the ground and come to a stop as quickly as possible. It's not just about touching down on a certain spot that, we specify. That's not what a short field approach is about. It's about coming in with minimal energy so that by the time you round out, you're hearing that stall warning go off, your wheels are touching, and there is literally no more energy left in that plane. You could not make that plane fly more if you tried. That's the goal with the short field approach and landing. And then from there, as specified in your own POH, you might retract the flaps and then at least simulate maximum braking, okay? By the way, what does it mean to simulate max braking? So I tell all my students, simulating full braking means using 70% of full braking. It doesn't mean just saying the words, simulating full braking or simulating max braking, and then not braking at all, okay? And it doesn't mean using just normal amounts of braking. It means simulating full braking, so get on those brakes more than usual, but not completely full, all right? We don't need to skid tires or anything like that. But as I say, 70% of full braking is what simulating full braking should kind of look like. So is a forward slip appropriate for a short field approach and landing? Yes, absolutely it is. Because we're coming in high to try to clear that obstacle, right? So we're going to be coming in high. We need to lose that altitude once we do clear that obstacle, and we can use that forward slip to help us do that while maintaining our airspeed and keeping that under control in the process. So forward slip, perfectly acceptable on a short field approach and landing. And, for your private pilot check ride, you have to demonstrate a forward slip to landing anyway. So the short field approach and landing might be the perfect opportunity to do that. So those are your three main types of approaches and landings: normal, soft, and short. And it's just important to remember that what is appropriate for one approach to landing, like your normal, is not necessarily going to be the same as what's appropriate for your short approach and landing, okay? So we need to make sure that we are not just putting emphasis on the actual landing itself, the actual touchdown, that we're not just worried about hitting a certain spot, like so many people are, unfortunately, but that we're actually utilizing and demonstrating the proper techniques for these different approaches and landings, all right? So finally, that brings us to our Power Off 180 for you commercial candidates out there. Now, the Power Off 180 is a little different. It's not your typical approach and landing. And when it comes to the Power Off 180, there's not too many rules. It's all about energy management. And we need to make sure that we're doing whatever is necessary, using all the tools that are available to us in order to put that plane down where we want to. So the three primary tools we have, of course, are flaps, the geometry of our approach, and forward slips. And to a large degree, you can use those however you deem necessary in order to control the energy in your aircraft to put it down on the specified point. Now, that's not to say that there is no such thing as a unstable approach with a Power Off 180. There certainly is. We can't be just coming in super fast and hot, diving at the ground with a full forward slip and putting flaps in and at the last second. And, that's obviously not going to end too well, neither for the check ride or for, if you ever find yourself in that situation for real, if you were to lose an engine, you don't want to be coming into whatever landing spot that you've chosen like that. So we do need to keep our approach stabilized, but when it comes to those tools, you might add flaps here, you might add flaps there, you might not add flaps at all. You might use a forward slip here or there. You might come in a little bit higher. You might get down a little lower to bleed off some energy and level flight. And you might use that geometry of your approach to overshoot final, perhaps do some little S-turns on final to lose altitude. Okay, so you've got a lot more flexibility and freedom in order to essentially just get that plane down where you want it to be without so many kind of structured rules around it. But it does still need to be stabilized and safe. We need to always make sure we're safe. So guys, should you go around on your check ride? Yes, absolutely you should, except for that Power Off 180. That's the one approach and landing that you are unfortunately not able to go around because it is simulating an emergency situation where you don't have an engine. So unless it's for safety of flight, we can't go around on the Power Off 180. But any other approach and landing, not only should you, but you are expected to per the ACS. And for your private and commercial applicants, you have to demonstrate a go around at least once on the check ride anyway. So don't be hesitant to do it, because if you don't do it on your own, the examiner is going to have to ask you to do one anyway. So that's a given there. But yes, you should always be expecting to go around. And then we also just need to make sure that the type of approach we're doing is appropriate to the technique we're trying to demonstrate. Okay? If your approach is unstable for the given type of approach that you're trying to demonstrate, like if you find yourself needing to do a forward slip on a normal approach and landing, go around. An unstabilized approach is the perfect reason to demonstrate a go around. So don't hesitate to do that. Hey guys, I hope this was helpful. I really appreciate you spending time with me today. Leave a comment down below. And again, for all of you listening out there on podcast world, if you haven't found the YouTube channel yet, it's Northwest Aeronaut on YouTube. For all of you on YouTube, you can find the podcast On Centerline on all major podcast providers. Really appreciate you spending time with me today, and we will see you next time on Centerline.